Sweetheart Room. We're reading Little House in the Big Woods, and we're at the bottom of page 142. Remember that Laura and Mary and Carrie and Ma and Pa traveled into the big woods to Grandma and Grandpa's, and it's the sugar snow, so they're collecting the sap and they're making maple sugar out of it, and now they're having a big dance. The big room filled with tall boots and swishing skirts, and ever so many babies were lying in rows on Grandma's bed. Uncle James and Aunt Libby had come with their little girl, whose name was Laura Ingalls, too. The two Lauras leaned on the bed and looked at the babies, and the other Laura said her baby was prettier than baby Carrie. She is not either, Laura said. Carrie's the prettiest baby in the whole world. No, she isn't, the other Laura said. Yes, she is. So can you see what they did with the babies? All the babies are laying on the bed, sleeping on the bed together, and there are the two Lauras arguing which baby is cuter. No, she isn't. Ma came sailing over in her fine delaine dress and said severely, Laura. So neither Laura said anything more. Uncle George was blowing his bugle. It made a loud ringing sound in the big room, and Uncle George joked and laughed and danced, blowing the bugle. Then Pa took his fiddle out of its box and began to play, and all the couples stood in squares on the floor and began to dance when Pa called the figures. So standing in squares means that they're standing two people and two people. Kind of looks like a little square. Can you see that? They're standing like that. And here is Uncle George blowing his bugle. And now Pa's going to play the fiddle. Grand, right and left, Pa called out, and all the skirts began to swirl, and all the boots began to stamp. The circles went round and round, all the skirts going one way and all the boots going the other way, and hands clasping and parting high in the air. Swing your partners, Pa called, and each gent bowed to the lady on the left. They all did as Pa said. Laura watched Ma's skirt swaying and her little waist bending and her dark head bowing, and she thought Ma was the loveliest dancer in the world. The fiddle was singing, Oh, you buffalo gals, aren't you coming out tonight? Coming out tonight, coming out tonight. Oh, you buffalo gals, aren't you coming out tonight to dance by the light of the moon? The little circles and the big circles went round and round, and the skirts swirled and the boots stamped and the partners bowed and separated and met again and bowed again. In the kitchen, Grandma was all by herself, stirring the boiling syrup in the big brass kettle. She stirred in time to the music. By the back door was a pail of clean snow, and sometimes Grandma took a spoonful of syrup from the kettle and poured it on some of the snow in a saucer. Laura watched the dancers again. Pa was playing the Irish washerwoman now. He called, Do-see, ladies, do-see, do, come down heavy on your heel and your toe. Can you see everybody dancing and Pa playing his fiddle? Laura could not keep her feet still. Uncle George looked at her and laughed. Then he caught her by the hand and did a little dance with her in the corner. She liked Uncle George. Everybody was laughing over by the kitchen door. They were dragging Grandma in from the kitchen. Grandma's dress was beautiful, too, a dark blue calico with autumn-colored leaves scattered all over it. Her cheeks were pink from laughing, and she was shaking her head. The wooden spoon was still in her hand. I can't leave the syrup, she said. But Pa began to play the Arkansas Traveler, and everybody began to clap in time to the music. So Grandma bowed to them all and did a few steps by herself. She could dance as prettily as any of them. The clapping almost drowned the music of Pa's fiddle. Suddenly, Uncle George did a pigeon wing, and bowing low before Grandma, he began to jig. Grandma tossed her spoon to somebody. She put her hands on her hips and faced Uncle George, and everybody shouted. Grandma was jigging. Laura clapped her hands in time to the music with all of the other clapping hands. The fiddle sang as it had never sung before. Grandma's eyes were snapping and her cheeks were red, and underneath her skirts her heels were clicking as fast as the thumping of Uncle George's boots. Everybody was excited. Uncle George kept on jigging, and Grandma kept on facing him, jigging too. The fiddle did not stop. Uncle George began to breathe loudly, and he wiped sweat from his forehead. Grandma's eyes twinkled. You can't beat her, George, somebody shouted. Uncle George jigged faster. He jigged twice as fast as he had been jigging. So did Grandma. Everybody cheered again. All of the women were laughing and clapping their hands, and all of the men were teasing George. George did not care, but he did not have breath enough to laugh. He was jigging. Pa's blue eyes were snapping and sparking. He was standing up, watching George and Grandma, and the bow danced over the fiddle strings. Laura jumped up and down and squealed and clapped her hands. Grandma kept on jigging. Her hands were on her hips and her chin was up and she was smiling. George kept on jigging, but his boots did not thump as loudly as they had thumped at first. Grandma's heels kept on clickety-clacking gaily. A drop of sweat dripped off of George's forehead and shone on his cheek. All at once he threw up both arms and gasped, "I'm beat!" And he stopped jigging. Everybody made a terrific noise, shouting and yelling and stamping, cheering Grandma. Grandma jigged just a little minute more, then she stopped. She laughed in gasps. Her eyes sparkled just like Pa's when he laughed. George was laughing too and wiping his forehead on his sleeve. Isn't that a great story? Suddenly Grandma stopped laughing. She turned and ran as fast as she could into the kitchen. The fiddle had stopped playing and all the women were talking at once and all of the men teasing George, but everybody was still for a minute when Grandma looked like that. So Grandma won the dancing jig. We'll read some more tomorrow.